Let's talk about Maremma and let's talk about Morellino di Scansano. And let's talk about Morellino di Scansano with one of the historical fathers of Morellino di Scansano, who is Erik Banti. Erik Banti began his activity as a winemaker and wine grower in 1981, if I am not mistaken, and has continued then to the present day. So it is more than 40 years that he has been involved in Maremma, in Morellino, and in viticulture. Eric was, as I said before, one of the fathers of Morellino because before him, Morellino was a very local wine that was known practically only in the province of Grosseto, where it is made. Then he came along and he came from a different work experience and a different life experience and started living first in Montemerano and then in Scansano and started making Morellino, and magically Morellino became one of the most important red wines in Tuscany. A welcoming wine, a nice smiling wine. It does not have the austerities of the great Brunellos, the great Chianti Classico, Gran Selezione wines, but instead it is a much more understandable wine also from the price point of view. And at this point, however, Eric's story, who better than he can tell us since he is.
Thank you to Daniele for giving me the floor. Daniele is a friend of mine. True, we know each other. Before he thought about writing wine and before I thought about making wine, we used to hang out in Rome. And after my tour experience concluded, I decided to shut it down and relocate to Montemerano. It's a charming house that I typically frequented on weekends. All of a sudden, I discovered a new requirement to complete certain tasks, mainly because I was still young and full of energy anyway. I had a chance encounter with Luigi Perinelli, and I called and told him Gino, because for friends it was Gino, not Luigi. Gino, I've permanently relocated to Montemerano. Any advice on what to do next? You have to make Morellino di Scansano. And I say, sorry, what is Morellino di Scansano? Because I was used to, then Daniele knows me well. I had stacks of Brunelli, stacks of Baroli, stacks of Barbareschi in my little cellar there in Montemerano. So he gave me some tips. He says, don't worry about it, and so on. And I have to say, it was an era, let's talk about the late 70s. Meanwhile, the production of wine began and it was being packaged in bottles before it was sold in demijohns. And at that time, there was no envy. Everyone willingly lent a hand to one another. When I gained more importance, I noticed the same camaraderie amongst all the winemakers. I had the pleasure of meeting winemakers from Piedmont to Sicily, all of whom were incredibly friendly. Inspired, I began visiting my farmer friends, even though I didn't own any vineyards myself. I would pick grapes alongside my farmer friends, two of whom were named Milady and Yvonne. True, and another one who also knows Daniele, the Signale made its debut in 1979 when I established a small winery near Montemerano. The first year, I carefully crafted the label and bottled the wine during the waning moon. I handpicked the grapes that are the essence of Signale, a testament to its quality. They were trial bottles. Then I also had some little problems with some wines, some grapes that Daniele knows, but I didn't know, like Silegiolo that had to be harvested much earlier because if not, it gave problems and so on.
Sure. I suggest we complete this section of the narrative and then proceed with the wine tastings to enhance the experience. In doing so, we
I
can
have
also
to
appreciate certain elements solely through the act of tasting wine, without the worry of a dry mouth. Precisely. Here now we start with the first of the wines, which is the Morellino di Scansano from 2020. The Morellino di Scansano is obviously the last one that you made. However, the label is the one that a mutual friend of ours called Stefano Milioni made for you still at the time. His name is Stefano Milioni, clearly. His name was and is It's Eric's Dubs, which has been a consistent label throughout time, remaining mostly unchanged. The label has endured over time.
To say that Stefano told me that he had found this drawing in a book of When I imported the Japanese paintings to Japan after many years, I asked my importer if the label indicated their Japanese origins. This request was prompted by a conversation with my friend Stefano. In Japan, the tradition affirms that peace in the family is symbolized by two birds facing each other, to which he responds affirmatively. So it was without knowing it is a great emotion that I then immediately translated with Stefano and of course with Daniele.
So this is the 2020, the Morellino di Scansano, the heir to the first production that you did, basically, because initially you only made this, right?
I'm also looking for today. We are the 41st vindication this year. I would like to keep Morellino always in the traditions. The text given by the four farmers who knew me formed the basis of these words. But this is just Sangiovese. There is a little bit of a few other things as well. So the Morellino disciplinary obligates us to 1% Sangiovese and 15% quite varied grapes, both Italian. So it can be Cilieggiolo, it can be Pugnitello, but it can also be Merlot or Cabernet. That's right, that's right. In 95, I did some new vineyards where I no longer put Cilieggiolo, even Alicante, but I prefer to do it with French grape varieties like Cabernet, Merlot. And so Pugneto and Pugnerà.
So there is a little bit of everything here besides 85% Sangiovese. Yes, absolutely, yes. However, the character is a Sangiovese character. The color is not at all too dark. You don't feel particularly the contribution of the Cabernet, which is usually a little bit of a marker. Instead, here the fundamental scent is a cherry scent, which is the classic scent of Sangiovese. Then also some slightly smoky notes. I don't remember if that makes wood or not.
No,
this one is just steel. So when you taste it, in my opinion, you feel all the freshness of such a wine. Then the 2020 was a vintage where the freshness came out quite well, more than in the 2021.
Is very much. I have to say, a note of the wines of the grapes produced in Maremma, being slightly earlier than Chianti and Brunello, Morellino is a warmer wine, benefiting from the coolness of the nearby sea. The Morellino vineyards are located 5 to 25 kilometers from the coast, which contributes to the unique characteristics of the grapes when they are harvested. At the beginning of September, we get very high acidities.
As you can notice, the acidity of this wine has a more significant impact than the Danini wine itself. Its acidity stimulates salivation, which in turn plays a crucial role in food-wine pairing. Unlike other wines, this particular one is not suited for wild dishes, but rather pairs perfectly with grilled steak. The acidity of the wine helps to balance out the natural fats in the meat, allowing it to complement the flavors without the need for prolonged cooking or additional ingredients. This aspect is essential, making it an excellent choice for those enjoying a tasty Florentine steak cooked over an open flame.
Despite its lacking in strong tannins, this wine boasts mild and sweet tannins, displaying a gentle and non-aggressive nature. It pairs remarkably well with various dishes, including cachuco, a classic fish stew, and fish
Let's
baked
give some
with
examples.
potatoes and tomatoes. Morellino is undeniably an incredibly versatile and eclectic wine.
Let's avoid making those who are currently listening overly hungry. Let's move on to the second wine. The second wine is called Spineto. Meanwhile, it's a Maremma Toscana. It is a wine of 2019, and it has a feature. It has a cork that unscrews like this. It's a screw cap. Now I pour the Spineto for you. Here it is. Maremma Toscana, tell me a little bit about this wine, because Maremma Toscana, already from the color, I can see that there is something else. There's not particularly too much Sangiovese, though.
No? However,
The color is much darker, so it means that some grapes are Bacchio a little bit darker
there's a
than
little bit
Sangiovese C.
there. The wine is made mostly from 60% Sangiovese, which is aged in stainless steel. Additionally, there is 20% Cabernet and 20% Merlot, both of which have aged briefly.
Is in barrique, but as it must be, because then eventually the Merlots and Cabernets love the micro-oxygenation that barrique gives. The thing that comes out is that it's spicy, certainly much more than Morellino, and it's a more austere wine, a little bit more astringent, tannic, just because it has this structure. Maybe also because of the vintage, which is a pretty rich vintage, the 2019, right? A great vintage.
We also talk about wines of a certain importance, also of degrees of body, because they are all wines that are over 14 degrees.
What does that have to do in?
Yes, but before, 20 years ago, if the wine had at 13 degrees and 1, let's put 13 and a half degrees, that the law allows you to do that. Today, the wine at 14 degrees and 1, I take it to 13 and a half. But the problem is that at 13 and a half, it is very difficult to bring it, because nowadays the wines, and if we see there the old Ciabatta vintages, they have 12 and a half, 13, 13 and a half. Some vintages, we are talking about wines that are more than 25 years old. It's evident that climate change is the root cause, and you surely recall, Daniele, that the pandemic arose during our time in school. Yes, precisely on the 1st of October.
The October anthem.
I
The October anthem
distinctively
is not
remember
October,
it
is it?
starting on that day, and our father had most beautiful farm that was on Monte Pucciano in Genavanti.
Have something to do
had
with
the
it?
farm of Bracesca, which is now Antinori's. The name is Antinori's. It's not Antinori's. He bought, in my opinion, I wasn't able to see this old brand, limiting my vision to its vintage state. And I was very sad about it, because you were not already in school. Whereas
I
now,
would have to do
let's
with
say
it.
on the 10th of October, the grape harvest that's over, then after that it continues. I remember the first few vintages in Maremma we also harvested on the 25th of October.
Around 70 vintages, including the 80s and 70s, are noted for their unusually low temperatures. Specifically, the years 76, 77, and 72 experienced particularly cold weather, yet these vintages have managed to progress significantly. Let's discuss some wine pairings that can complement a variety of dishes. This particular wine goes well with slightly heavier and more flavorful meals like lasagna or pasta with hare ragout. It can also be paired with dishes featuring game meat, as it can handle their robust flavors.
It's a wine that 80% of it is sold in North America.
They have no problem with
When
screw
I
caps.
informed
No.
them about the option of using Stelvin screw caps, they were all highly supportive and applauded.
But do you know why? Because if you work in a wine bar, for example, and you have to constantly open bottles or serve bottles, the DoctorWine is so convenient because you take so much less time in service. And all in all, for wines that don't have to bottle 30 years, it's a closure that all in all is just fine.
Very practical, I find it as well. But even if I had to, when I take a bottle home, if I have a regular cork, a Stelvin cork, I take the one with a cork.
This is not always the case because in Italy, especially, there is a certain distrust about this, but it will pass.
Stelvin. In America, they sell wine.
80, 100 euros. Absolutely. You think that in New Zealand you can't cork it anymore with cork. Only the Stelvine, and in Australia almost all the wines are produced corked.
A wine that tends to be made as a blending for the North American market, who want a lot of the stuff.
So we come to the last wine, which is kind of the battleship of the winery, the flagship of the winery, and that is the Ciabatta. The Ciabatta, this is supposed to be a 2018, as you can see, but we actually have a surprise because this is the preview of 2019, which we tasted together for the first time. 2019 is Banti's Ciabatta, which used to be Morellino di Scansano. Is it still Morellino di Scansano? Yes, still Morellino di Scansano. I am 5 years old. This wine is mainly Sangiovese, accounting for about 85% of the blend.
90% and a 10%
That
Cabernet
much.
Sauvignon.
Ciabatta tuna is abundantly present in Ciabatta, totaling around 500 liters to be frank. Ciabatta is from 1985, which was the first vintage, if I'm not mistaken, 83. However, the 85 was the first really good Ciabatta. I still recall when Ciabattas received the prestigious rating of 85 on the first edition of Slow Food's Red Shrimp Guide. At that time, our Sigala hadn't even become affiliated with Slow Food. And it was the first wine from that area there that became a myth, basically, right? Because then the others came later. And this is the 2019 edition. So think about it, from 1983 to 2019, how many Ciabatta have passed under in the barrel, in Erik's barrels? And this is precisely 2019, which was a mere preview, yet what an incredible year it turned out to be, right?
I hope that in a beautiful evolution of the wine, because it needs obviously now bottles, it is a wine that will be put on the market in a year almost.
I think great wines, but really great wines, are ready quite immediately and then they last a long time. It's a strange thing, but that's almost always the case. If you think about the great Bordeaux, some Barolos, some Burgundy wines, but after 4 or 5 years they are ready. And then they last half a century even sometimes. But they're not so, how should I say, unhinged. Sullen initially. They're a little young, all right. Here a pinch of tannins can be felt. However, if you smell the aromas, they are already aromas of a sharpness, of a complexity that is really remarkable. So it's a wine that already can be drunk.
Say that I am happy with the vintage, because then the Ciabatta is a wine that has to please mainly me, while the other wines I make so I can also sell them. I like the Ciabatta.
Why is it called Ciabatta? Why is it the name of the vineyard initially?
The name of the place where I got the first small vineyard I had, which is located in the vicinity of Monte Merano, only half a kilometer away. It is known as the Ciabatta locality, but I wasn't fond of the name, so I expressed my dissatisfaction. Let's put it as Ciabatta, so much so that someone who was selling of Ciabatta in Milan, in Monza, I don't know where, bought me at first the quantities of huge ones because I just sold ciabatta bread. Is ciabatta a type of bread? Yes, yes. And it is also known because then when you have to name a wine, you have to think also said in another language. If you put the Italian in English, it sounds bad.
But like also the R for Chinese, it's complicated to pronounce. And so it is much easier to pronounce a word where the R is not there, because there is precisely a difficulty, just as we have difficulty pronouncing gutturals or aspirates in Latin languages. Everyone has their own difficulties or peculiarities at the language level. However, this ciabatta, in my opinion, is really one of the best versions that have been made.
In English, we say is my signature. Your signature. This is then when I write in English, because first I write in English, then afterwards I translate into Italian.
One thing I didn't tell you, and I didn't ask you especially, your name, Erik, depends on a fact that is accurate, which is that you also have a Danish origin. Yes, mother was Danish.
So, can you speak Danish fluently? Yes, definitely. Then I must say that I am also good at it, because apart from chewing languages quite well, but I am good at it because then Danish, who you speak it with, it's not that there are a lot of people, there are only 5 million people in the world. I typically thrive during my occasional visits to Denmark, whether it's once or twice a year. I used to own a house there as well. Copenhagen is a wonderful city, so now I don't want to make a speech about the Danes. However, the dogs don't even... Wow, it's amazing how happy they all are in that state. The citizens there feel so protected, which is fantastic. It makes me think of that time I took the subway and sat next to a gentleman with a bicycle. He turned out to be the Minister of Agriculture, not just an ordinary Dane. I couldn't help but wonder when something like that will ever happen here in our country. I truly believe that it will. To have accepted, and I would like to have your judgment in public of this wine. I really believe in this wine.
Yes, pleasure. So let's say if we wanted to conduct an organoleptic tasting, you should definitely notice that the color is incredibly deep and intense. Very beautiful and youthful also, because the garnet note is not fully expressed yet, just because the wine is very young. The aromas are already sense of wonderful complexity, and they are very sharp. You recognize the fruits, the spices in a very precise way. There is also a note of blood orange that is a bit of a constant in your wines. And then in the mouth, there is this very nice relationship between acidity and tannins, that is, between what makes you salivate and what inhibits salivation. The acidity makes you salivate and the tannins inhibit salivation. This is a kind of taste dialectic between two elements that are related to each other. In my opinion, this is the most interesting thing there is in all great wines, in the sense that a wine that is only tannic drains your tongue, your mouth, and you can't drink it. So this relationship, this texture between the tannic aspects and the acidity aspects is very important. These aspects are very important just to create flavor complexity. And in my opinion, this wine has these aspects, and it has a great gustatory complexity that is not trivial for a wine that comes from that part of Maremma. Because, as I initially mentioned, Morellino di Scansano is typically known for its joyful and cheerful character that doesn't have such enormous complexity and doesn't even want to have it. This is a Morellino di Scansano that instead has some complexity. By now there are 4 or 5 that have that kind of character, but this one in this vintage has it in a very particular and very defined way. And that, in my opinion, is the thing.
I have to say that the grapes are very reselected from one vineyard. were brought to a very low temperature before they were fermented, so they could, with the implementation of controlled temperatures, one can achieve significantly longer fermentations.
Important. Having said that, we're drinking it today, but this will come out in a few months, maybe a year. And for now, we're going to enjoy the 2018 for a little while longer, which is perhaps less rich than the 2019, however. It's very good as well, and therefore easier to drink, if you will, immediately. However, this 2019 will be Erik Bankel's big surprise. Yes, the Chieta is there.
Yes,
Thank
the
you.
accipit is there. Thank you.